Hi there, welcome back to our annual program about the Shangri-La Security Dialogue in Singapore. I'm Yang. Again, issues are prioritized about maritime disputes in the South China Sea, where even President Duterte of the Philippines welcomes China's presence in his country and our assistance with their counter-terror campaign, as well as his own war against drugs in the streets. Denuclearization in the DPRK remains a front-page story, as Mr. Trump will meet with Mr. Kim Jong-un in Singapore as scheduled. How do senior policy advisors on both sides look at the mil-to-mil ties between the United States and China? Will the DPRK be nuclear-free and eventually open itself up by signing a peace treaty? What about the regional security mechanism in Asia when a new Cold War is allegedly descending on East Asia? Now, we are delighted to be joined here by Major General Yao Yunzhu, who's retired from the Academy of Military Sciences of the PLO, and we are very happy to have her on this kind of discussion right here in Singapore. Next to her is Professor Robert Kelly from Pusan National University. He is an expert of security issues in Northeast Asia. Welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you for having me.
The major issues on the agenda of Shangri-La Dialogue 2018. The American leadership of primacy should not be challenged, regional security in Asia, the denuclearization of DPRK, as well as terrorism and counterterrorism. Which do you think is the most important? The fifth one is raising the bar for regional security cooperation. Does that mean that China should be dismissed from the RIMPAC military exercise? Is China sorry for this, or Americans just get the job done because we have been taken as a strategic competitor by the national policy paper?
I think this time the topics, the discussion topics are all important ones. As to your question that how the bar will be raised so that China will be excluded, I don't think China can ever be excluded.
Is it a big deal for the PLA not to be part of the RIMPAC
really,
exercise?
because China is just too big, too strong,
to be ignored,
to be excluded.
Even
in military affairs, and the disinviting China from the RIMPAC is not a big deal. The invitation is sent by the Pentagon. If the Pentagon thinks that the invitation had been a favor to China, it can take it away as a punishment. But in my view, this kind of cooperation is good for both sides and for all the participants. It's a multilateral joint exercise. More than 20 countries will be participating. So it should be a kind of favor-giving practice.
Robert, do you think cutting off communication between the two militaries in this important region will be part of the prelude to a new Cold War descending on East Asia? Because look at the lessons we can draw from the Korean War: miscommunication, misunderstanding, and mismanagement of the crisis. And do you think we are likely to repeat the same stupid mistakes?
Oh, sure. Human beings repeat the same mistakes again and again. I think it's bad that military to military is cut off. I would like to see China and the U.S. Navy, the PLAN and the U.S. Navy operate more, or at least interact more, have more conferences, more events, things like RIMPAC. I can't speak to the specific cancellation. I know there are security concerns about Chinese participation. But broadly speaking, yes, I think you're correct. A severing of communication is exactly the kind of thing that worsens misperceptions and aids hawks on both sides. And we, the Americans, should try to talk to the Chinese as much as possible. No one wants a collision.
Well, what kind of signals did the American Navy send to the PLA when they sent 2 warships into the territorial waters of the Chinese islands in the South China Sea after allegedly China landed 2 bombers in island in Xisha? I mean, this is no big deal from the Chinese perspective, but the U.S. says, well, this is yet another sign of the Chinese assertiveness. Therefore, they say, no, we've got to push it back. So what do you think of this tit for tat and escalation of the tensions in this volatile region?
The Chinese view is, of course, that it's for China to decide what kind of military activities it's going to conduct on its own territory. And this time, the so-called freedom of navigation operations by 2 warships, destroyers, into South China Sea. It's not on the Sixparty Islands is further north into the Perennial.
Therefore, is it a very provocative?
It's more provocative than before because all the Perennial Islands, China had drawn the basic sea line and have made it very clear where are China's territorial waters, and it's not because China has not actually made it very clear or the basic sea line. Based on the basic sea line, you can draw the territorial waters and then exclusive economic zones. But in Perennial, it's crystal clear.
Initially, the Chinese viewers and netizens may have been seriously misguided by the intrusion of American warships, destroyers in South China Sea, because we thought it was yet again another innocent passage into the territorial waters, but it was not. It was not. Okay. And therefore, what kind of signals did that move deliver to parties concerned in the game?
Sure. I think it's pretty clear the Americans do not accept as crystal clear China's assertions to the paracels and Spratlys and other parts of the South China Sea. I mean, that's the big flashpoint coming in the future. That is my biggest concern about a maritime collision between the United States and China, because the territorial claims are conflicting, and the Chinese are pushing, and the Americans are pushing back. And that's how I read it. This is a direct American response to claims that the U.S. does not recognize.
Centerpiece of the current debates that are flaring up between the two militaries is, I'm afraid, the alleged militarization of the South China Sea.
Right.
How do you define militarization?
Yeah, it's. I think the U.S. government or U.S. military is using militarization in a misleading way, seeing that if you deploy weapon systems on an occupied island, it is kind of. But militarization is it's not on pieces of rocks or islands. It's in the whole area. And in South China Sea, in the Nanshan or Sixparty Islands, China occupied 7, Vietnam 29, and the Philippines nearly 20. All of these reefs and rocks or small islands, they are military outposts from the very beginning. So how do you define them? All of them have weapon systems. All of them are stationed with military troops. So if you say China is militarizing the area, the South China Sea, what about the other occupiers or other claimants? And what about the United States, who has been sending destroyers, cruisers, even nuclear, even aircraft carriers into the area, into South China Sea, frequently to do the kind of freedom of navigation operations or even military exercise, very intense military exercise? Is this not, are these things not a militarization?
The scheduled summit between Mr. Kim Jong-un and President Donald Trump. Do you think we can trust your president, given the trajectory of unpredictability, and he off again, on again, and
yeah.
We've been left deeply puzzled. Well, let's put aside this issue of whether it's going to take place or not.
Right.
Presumably, if it's to take place, what will happen in the DPRK? Do you think we're going to eventually have the verifiable, irreversible, and the comprehensive denuclearization under the stare of the nuclear watchdog?
Right. I think CVID is highly unlikely. I think North Korea will not give up everything, which means ultimately any deal in Singapore will involve a negotiation in which the Americans give up something and the North Koreans give up something. It would be astonishing if the North Koreans gave up everything, because they spent 50 years developing these weapons. It is highly unlikely they will simply give them up in 6 months. The concessions they would demand from the United States for CVID would be enormous. They would ask for huge concessions from the United States, which America would likely not give. So
your Secretary of State was a CIA director, and he oversaw the whole process himself. sending advance teams to Pyongyang, inviting Kim Jong-un to Washington, and had very careful closed-door discussions about details. It means both sides are very serious about the possibility that it should take place to guarantee the future of Northeast Asia. You are an expert of Northeast Asia security studies. So do you think that the peace agreement is likely to be signed and truth will be history? And do you think the bilateral relationship between Pyongyang and Washington will be normalized with the establishment of your embassy in Pyongyang?
Right. I think in 2 weeks or 10 days, it is highly unlikely that will happen. I do think that this will probably lead to further discussions and meetings, staff-level meetings, maybe a second summit in the future. I could see the possibility of a peace treaty, but not in 2 weeks. It's all going much too fast. The ideological and strategic divisions between the United States and North Korea are so wide, I do not believe they can be bridged in just 2 weeks. I think it's possible they could be done so in the future, but more staff work is needed, more diplomacy, more details about North Korea's nuclear program, what they have, where is it, how much, right, who will inspect it, the IAEA or something like that. I mean, there's so many big questions, and they cannot be resolved in 10 days. So it may happen, but in the future.
Major General, here is the likely scenario in the DPRK, our neighboring country, starting from his grandparent, Kim Il-sung. You know, we started to be, we had to have a very special relationship, by the way, and the Mutual Defense Treaty is kind of still kept alive. Now, the issue, by the end of the day, I'm afraid, is whether Mr. Kim Jong-un will follow China's example in opening itself up, in opening up the DPRK and have a reform, so on and so forth. How strong is that possibility?
That's what we all hope for, but I just cannot speculate on how likely it's going to happen.
But there was a very important party conference in Pyongyang,
yes,
right?
and on that party conference, I think the decision has been made by the top leader that the DPRK is going to concentrate to focus on economic development, on the improvement of people's life, and maybe at the same time, during the process of denuclearization, and the summit is going to be held here in Singapore, and we still remember that China's yeah. Go ahead.
Exactly.
Please.
Perhaps what you're going to say is what I want to ask. Mr. Kim Jong-un came to China twice before the scheduled summit between Donald Trump and him, and that it gave rise to a lot of speculations as to what role China plays. Are we the architect behind the whole scenario? Do you both believe that the route to Pyongyang actually goes through Beijing? Is that true, that China actually plays the leading role? And does it automatically mean at the same time China will have to be one of the parties to declare the end of the truce, end of hostility in the Korean relationship? Instead, we're going to have a peace agreement.
Yeah, I think China should be part of it, because China is a member of is a signatory of the truce treaty, and in the transition or replacement of a peace treaty with the truce treaty agreement, that China should play a part. That's definitely true. But on your question that whether all road to Pyongyang has to be through Beijing, literally it's true, because all the flights has to transit in Beijing Capital International Airport. So far, but if you want to take other transportation vehicles, a boat or a bike or a car.
A bike?
Maybe.
Like a Bush Jr.? Okay.
Right.
Or maybe you could go by other way. I'm not sure. But I think the two visits by Chairman Kim and has been followed by large delegations of the DPRK to visit all the many areas in China just to try to learn something from China to see how China has developed the setting up of economic special zones and districts and things like that. So I have...
Yes, indeed, his father, his late father, Kim Jong-un, must have drawn a lot of inspirations from China's success story in reform and opening up. This year witnesses the 40th anniversary of China's opening up. We actually uncover the historic talk between Li Guangyu, the dismantle, and the late senior leader Deng Xiaoping. What do you think of, say, the regional security cooperation? I mean, this is one of the issues. What does that actually imply?
For Northeast Asia, I think a resumption of the six-party talks or perhaps four-party talks. I think, as you said, any final peace deal in Northeast Asia will require the assent of the two Koreas, right, the United States and also China. It would be nice if Russia and Japan agreed also, but at minimum, those four parties need to be a part of any final deal, right, because they're also vested in Korea. And so the sooner we get to a multilateral framework that brings all the parties together, the better.
Thank you so much, Major General and Professor Robert. You are watching Dialogue with two distinguished guest speakers here in Singapore who are here to attend the Shangri-La Dialogue. Major General Yao Yingzhu from the Academy of Military Sciences of PLA and Professor Robert Kelly from the Pusan National University. He's an expert of regional security studies about Northeast Asia. We'll be back in a short while. Please do stay with us. Welcome back. So, Major General, six-party talks, is it, do we have any possibility of resuming this regional security mechanism, since many say, sadly, this process is moribund. We cannot revitalize that. Do you think this region does need badly a security mechanism? And what, if it's that the case, what kind of a security mechanism is needed?
The denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula will never be an easy process. It's not only the nuclear weapons, it's the truce treaty, truce agreement, or regime, and peace regime. And also, it has to do with the international, the interstate relationships that's very complex. And I think if we have to really denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, we have to think of longer-term, overarching framework to deal each and every issues that's in the Northeast Asia. It's so that we can sustain the process in the first place, and then we can realize denuclearization. We can really open the door to peace, a lasting peace and prosperity. So China's part is essential. China's part is essential. But as for what kind of framework it will be, 6 parties, 4 parties, 5 parties, it will do. Only we have to have overarching multilateral framework to deal with all the issues.
Very articulate about the Chinese position. But Robert, given the intractable multiple challenges arising from the presidency of Donald Trump, it's almost impossible to have this regional security mechanism in place during his administrations. But eventually, what should be a sound and a safe mechanism that may bring all parties to the table and regularly discuss issues of urgency?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's a lot of uncertainty on the American side now because of Donald Trump's sort of erratic character, and that doesn't help. That just makes everything much harder than it needs to be. I do think the hope of the six-party talks turning into a permanent Northeast Asian regional security organization, I do like that idea. I think the Chinese threw that idea around like 10 years ago. That strikes me as a good idea. You bring all the major players together, have them meet maybe once or twice a year or something like that. There is no formal mechanism in Northeast Asia. There's nothing like ASEAN or anything like that, or the ARF in Northeast Asia, and the sooner we have one, the easier many of these issues will be, because none of them will be decided by individual players alone, right? I mean, the Chinese, the Americans, the Koreans all have to be involved in a formal solution, so if we don't have the framework, it's not going to happen.
Many observers in international studies are crying foul about the repeat of Cold War in Northeast Asia. But even at the height of the Cold War, the former Soviet Union and the United States, the two superpowers, did have their regular channel to communicate, to avoid having a head-on collision, because they were nuclear armed, and very dangerous to have the balance of terror or mutually assured destruction philosophy. Today, it seems we have none of that. That's very dangerous. We do have what you call the emergency communication channel between the two militaries in the South China Sea, but region-wise in Northeast Asia, do you think we're going to have a Cold War, first of all?
Well, I think you have that to a certain extent between South Korea and North Korea already, particularly with the Americans involved on the South Korean side. I don't think that China and the United States need to fall into some kind of Cold War in Northeast Asia. I think it's far more likely in Southeast Asia, where the territorial issues are in much greater dispute. In Northeast Asia, the borders are all in place. And North Korea is really not a sort of Marxist state anymore, so it's not clear to me that we actually have to have an ideological split in Northeast Asia. I think really what we need is China, the United States, and South Korea to cooperate in bringing North Korea to better behavior. Fewer provocations, better on human rights, less illicit behavior, smuggling methamphetamines and counterfeiting currency. I think that's what we really need, is some cooperation to push the North Koreans to normalize, to behave and according to international norms more.
With such a hawkish team beside President Trump, like Navarro, John Bolton, Steve Bannon has been dismissed from the White House, but ex-generals are a majority of the advisors to the president, who never reads papers from the CIA, who never trusts policymakers and advisors like Brookings or Carnegie. So this guy, Mr. Trump, could be very unreliable. Or do you think it's the other way around? He's after a business executive. He has his own logic and reckoning about transactional deals. So what do you think of his reliability and credit?
I think he's transactional. He's doing business.
Well, he's better than the Hillary Clinton.
I will not make that a compression, but I think we should give some credit to President Trump, at least for his courageous opening up to the DPRK, to his accepting the suggestion, the summit suggestion in the first place. He has done something that no president, U.S. president, had done before. So I think he deserves more credit than he's getting from his own people right now. And when the summit is upcoming, what we should do is to wish it all success. At least wish it as beginning of a commitment to a long or short process of denuclearization. And what we should all do is to hope for the best, prepare for the best, not to be too negative. That's my plan.
The chronic issue between the two militaries, I'm afraid, is mistrust, right? Mistrust between the United States and China. Perhaps since the end of the Cold War, with the disappearance of the biggest common enemy of the former Soviet Union, China came here to replace that kind of a threat assessment. So, with the modernization of the Chinese armed forces, particularly the military build-up in blue waters, do you think we're going to challenge the American maritime leadership? The presence of the Chinese blue water navy in South China Sea aims to provide public service, public goods, or it's the other way around? Is that China will have to become a maritime power? Because by being just a continental power, we would not be called a major power. If you can combine maritime power with continental power, like Professor Wang Gungwu of National University of Singapore says over and over, China would not become a superpower. So what do you think of this vision?
And
we have so many more global stakes as we are the biggest trading power.
I think development of Chinese military capability is a natural process. It's a natural result of China's development, of China's economy. It's the second largest economy.
That doesn't come as a surprise, but what do you think of the discourse of a Thucydides tribe?
Thucydides tribe?
Right. Professor Allison says...
I don't think China and United States would fall into
You're going to hear a lot
trap.
of noises about the eventual and major war between the two militaries here at the Shangri-La dialogue.
It's not 2,000 years ago. Time has changed so much. And the Cold War thing is just very old things. And China and the United States has so much common interest. There is not a very decisive or very strong ideological struggle between them. And China has been risen within the system, the world order, dominated by United States. But there is one thing that is maybe is exceptional, that is the Chinese military has not been accommodated into a regional or global security architecture. So the United States has for a long time been more or less hostile to the military part of China, not to the economic part, not to the political part, not to the people-to-people part, but to the military part. It's very suspicious, very alarming.
Is that because is that why Americans conduct regular surveillance missions near our territorial waters and islands? What do you make of the Thucydides tribe? Is that inevitable? Is that a popular theory in the United States?
Yeah, it is. Oh, sure. I think there's a sort of general belief. I don't think it's inevitable, though. I do think it's correct also that the lack of a major ideological rift between the United States and China helps a lot. That sort of reduces the level of sort of like rhetorical and intellectual tension between the two sides. Most of the divisions between China and the United States are fairly traditional national interest ones. Territory, land, where do borders fit? And the good news is that those borders are mostly at sea rather than at land, right? So you're talking about a few islands here and there. That's much less important than, say, traditional European disputes where there were over big border areas with lots of people in them. I think a maritime conflict between China and the United States is much less severe than, say, a ground-based conflict like you saw during World War II. So it doesn't have to be, it's not inevitable, and it doesn't have to be a catastrophe.
And China has no territory disputes with the United States, whether on land or on the sea, or on the sea. It's disputes between China and its neighboring countries. And the United States, truly or wrongly, has regarded this kind of territory disputes as challenging to its dominance, maritime dominance in the area. And I don't think it's right or it's justified for the United States to be so suspicious or so unsecure. It has a very unsecure feeling now.
I thank you so much for your participation and meaningful discussion about the issues of common concern between the two major powers. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.